What is going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, I want to show you a brutal attacking game play between the GOAT Magnus Carlsen and, of course, Arjun Erigaisi of India, one of the hottest players of 2024. And yes, this game did take place in the 2023 World Blitz Championships. And here we go. In the game, Magnus Carlsen opening 1e4, best by test, and Arjun Erigaisi goes 1c5, the Sicilian Defense. Now we have knight f3 and e6, Arjun perhaps heading for a Khan or a Taimanov after, say, knight c6 or a6, but instead of going d4, heading for the open Sicilian, here Magnus does throw a curveball and he plays the move d3, heading for some sort of closed Sicilian. Now Arjun, he has many different options in the game. He does go knight c6, a very fine move. Now we have g3 and d5, Arjun breaking in the center, and now the threat, of course, is d takes e4, then d takes and queen takes d1, taking the queens off the board, forcing king takes, and the king would lose the right to castle. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he must find a way either to take on d5 or block that impending check. Now here, Magnus, he does not go e takes d5. That is perfectly fine. For example, e takes, then d4 would lead to a good version of perhaps an isolated queen's pawn for black that would be good for white. Now instead of that, he does block the impending check with the move knight to d2. That way, if black does take on e4, d takes, then d takes, suddenly the queens are not exposed to each other and queen takes d1 is not a move. Now here, Arjun Erigaisi, he continues, knight f6, very standard stuff. White goes bishop g2, bishop b7, and then short castles for white. So white here has the King's Indian attack setup, and his idea may include perhaps rook e1, then e5, gaining space in the center and starting a Kingside attack. So Arjun Erigaisi, what is he going to do about it? Well, the standard move here for black is going to be short castle, getting your king to safety on the king side. You simply allow the attack, and if white goes e5, you go knight d7, and your plan is to hang on the king side while you counterattack on the queen side with, say, b5, a5, and so on. Now here, instead of short castles, Arjun Erigaisi, he plays a very interesting move, queen to c7. Now, what is the point of this move? It's very simple. The queen does control the e5 square, so now e5 is not a possibility. That loses a pawn, as that square is covered twice by the queen and the knight, and only guarded once by the knight on f3. So e5 would lose a pawn. The knight takes e5 on the spot. Now, instead of that here, Magnus has many different options. You can take on d5. That's a very passive choice. You can also go rook e1, setting up e5. You can also go, say, c3, getting space on the queen side. But instead of all those options, Magnus does go a4, gaining space on the queen side with the alpha 0 a pawn. Now here, Arjun Erigaisi, again, he does not castle. Instead, he does go for the move h6, a very interesting choice. Now, what is the point of this move? Well, we're about to find out. You typically don't want to make pawn moves on the king side in this line of the King's Indian attack. However, Arjun Erigaisi, he has a very specific reason in mind for going h6, as we're about to find out. Now, Magnus, rook e1, the standard move, setting up e5 on the next move. Now, Arjun, he does castle, short castles on the board, and now Magnus has the option of going e5 right away, of course, as that pawn is defended twice by the knight and the rook, and only attacked twice by the queen and the knight. And if you go e5, then say knight d7, queen e2 again defends the pawn, and you have 1, 2, 3 defenders versus the 1, 2, 3 attackers. So again, the pawn would be defended. Now, instead of that immediately, Magnus does go queen to e2. A very interesting move. Magnus, again, keeping his opponent on his toes, not showing his full plan yet, and he still reserves the option of going e takes d5 if he wants it. Now here, Arjun Erigaisi, the main plan for black in this position is to set up the b5 break, gaining space on the queen side. So with that in mind, moves like a6 and rook b8 make a lot of sense. However, instead of that, Arjun, being a very creative player, he loves original positions, he does go b6 here. Now, what is the idea of b6? Well, the bishop on c8 now has access to both b7 and a6. So the bishop may want to go to one of these squares. We'll have to wait and see which one it is going to be. Now, Magnus, he does gain space in the center, e5. And as promised, I am going to show you the point of h6. And here, Arjun Erigaisi, he plays a move that Magnus Carlsen himself likes to play in a lot of weird openings. He goes knight to h7 instead of knight d7. And this move is extremely unusual. Black almost always goes knight d7 in this line. Now, what is the point of knight h7? Well, by going knight h7 instead of knight d7, the knight does stay over here on the king side, and it may help out in the impending kingside attack by white. However, the problem with this move, that knight could also be a target. For example, if the white queen and bishop line up on this diagonal in the future somehow, that knight could be very vulnerable. And it also slows down black's play on the queen side, as the knight will not have access to, say, c5 in the future after maybe a c4 advance. So very double-edged decision by Arjun. Now Magnus, knight f1, continuing the attack. And now Arjun, how does he want to proceed? Well, there are two main options. You can set up b5 right away. For example, a6, rook b8, then b5. Or you can put the light squared bishop somewhere, maybe on one of these squares. And that actually is what Arjun does here. He goes bishop a6, lining up the bishop on this diagonal where it does hit the queen on the e2 square. This move does stop c4, or d4, sorry, and that could be highly relevant if Arjun does go c4 in the future, and the bishop and the pawn would have a lot of pressure on that pawn on d3. Now, Magnus, he knows this, and he ignores that threat for now. He just goes h4, bringing the alpha 0 h-pawn into the game, my personal favorite move on the chessboard. Now here, Arjun, knight b4, jumping in with the knight, pressuring c2. Now, again, c4 is a very real threat. The idea being c4, then c takes d3, and then bishop takes, winning that pawn on d3 and hitting the queen with tempo. Now, Magnus, he knows this. He's going to defend. In the game, he does go queen to d1, defending with the queen, getting off this diagonal. That way, if black goes to c4, for example, then you can simply take on c4, d takes c4, without worrying about bishop takes c4 in response, hitting the queen with tempo once again. Now, here, Arjun. He has many different options in this position, but the computer likes the idea of getting that rook on the a8 square into play. For example, rook b8, c8, and d8 are all very playable, but instead in the game, he plays a very curious move, king to h8, sliding his king off the g8 square to the h8 square. Maybe the king will be safer on h8 in the future. Overall, this sort of seems like a waiting move, essentially waiting to see what Magnus will do in this position. Now here, Magnus, the strongest move is going to be bishop d2, targeting that knight on b4, threatening bishop takes d4. Now, instead of that, Magnus plays a very standard move in the King's Indian attack, especially this part of it, simply the move bishop f4, bolstering that pawn on e5 with the bishop. f4 is a very natural square for the bishop, but overall d2 would have been a little bit stronger, again targeting that very vulnerable knight on b4. Now, Arjun Erigaisi, once again, he has many different options to proceed here. For example, again, rook b8, c8, or d8 are all very playable, activating the rook on the back rank. Instead of that, he goes for a different idea that is just as good. That is the move d4, gaining space in the center and locking down that central pawn structure quite a bit. Now he has ideas like bishop b7, activating the bishop on this diagonal, and also the knight has access to the d5 square, that being a very important detail. And on d5, that knight would target the bishop on f4, and very importantly, if white does go bishop d2, then again, knight d5 is possible, getting out of the impending attack. And that actually is what happens, or at least Magnus does threaten that move. Bishop d2 is the move for Magnus, threatening bishop takes b4. And Arjun Erigaisi, is he going to go knight d5, getting out of the attack? Well, that would be the strongest move, and knight c6 is also very playable. But instead of these two moves here, Arjun Erigaisi, he ignores the threat of bishop takes b4, and he just goes rook a to d8, centralizing his rook. Now, this is a significant mistake, as it turns out bishop takes b4, damaging black's pawn structure and trading the bishop for the knight is very, very strong here. After, say, bishop takes, then c takes b4, again, black's pawn structure on the queen side, and even in the center, will be permanently damaged. After that, white can go, say, rook to e4, threatening rook takes d4, and so on, and he will have a lot of pressure in the center and on the queen side. However, Magnus, he doesn't do that, at least not yet. He just goes b3 here, bolstering his queen side, sort of a waiting move, but overall very dubious, as black again has the option of going knight d5, centralizing the knight. However, Arjun Erigaisi, this was his plan all along. He doesn't move the knight. He just goes bishop b7. Arjun, being a very original player, again, playing a very weird idea here. And finally, Magnus does try to punish it. Bishop takes b4 is the move. Now c takes is forced. And again, now we have that very awkward pawn structure in the center and on the queen side for Arjun. d4 being sort of a vulnerable pawn here. It can't be defended by the pawn on e6. that makes it virtually a different pawn island here. And again, white's going to have ideas like, in the future, maybe rook e4 after these bishops are traded off. And again, d4 is going to be a very vulnerable pawn, not to mention the pawns on the queen side, a7, b6, and b4. Now here, Magnus, knight 3, d2, a very strong move, trying to trade off those light squared bishops. Now, this is normally not something you want to do when you have the fianchetto on g2. The light squares around the king side are going to be a little more vulnerable. However, again, the benefit is you can go rook to e4 in the future once those light squared bishops are traded off, and that is what happens here. So, bishop takes, then king takes, and now Arjun Erigaisi. The strongest move here is rook d5, intending rook c5. The rook would be very active on the 5th rank. It defends e5 and pressures the pawn on c2. Instead of that, he goes for a different but somewhat related idea. Rook d to c8, doubling up pressure on the c file, targeting c2, but it turns out this move isn't really that big of a deal. Here, Carlsen, knight to c4, defending c2 with the blockade. Now, of course, the knight blocks the c file, so queen takes c2 is not a possibility. Now, Arjun, a6, threatening b5, trying to dislodge the knight, but Magnus, he has everything under control. He just goes rook to a2, and now b5 would just be a weakening move by Arjun. Again, he would be left with double pawns on the b file after, say, a takes, then a takes. And yes, he already does have double pawns on the b file, on b6 and b4. But again, after b5, then a takes, those pawns would be even weaker than they are right now. Now, Arjun, it turns out he does go b5. Arjun, being the active player, he finds the most active idea in this position. So, b5, then knight c d2 for Magnus. And again, that pawn on c2 is defended by the rook. Therefore, queen takes c2 is not a possibility, at least not yet. All right, Arjun, rook f d8, activating the other rook, very solid. But now, Carlsen, a takes, and then queen to f3, flying in with the queen. The queen is now slicing across the board in the spirit of the Catalan light squared bishop. And beyond that, very importantly, it does target the very weak pawn on the f7 square. Now, Arjun is going to have to defend. King g8 is the move. And it turns out the king was better placed on g8 after all. Here it wasted a tempo going h8, then g8. And really on h8, it didn't do anything for his position. Now, Magnus, queen to e4, centralizing the queen and increasing the pressure on that knight on h7. Arjun will have to watch out for that. So with that in mind here, Arjun, knight to f8, trying to reroute his knight to a better square. Now, Magnus, knight to f3, bringing in the other knight and increasing the pressure on that pawn on d4. Arjun, what is he going to do about it? Well, it turns out you can defend the pawn on d4 with the queen or the bishop. For example, queen c5, b6, and c3 all defend that pawn. c3, I can't draw arrows. Queen to c3, all defend that pawn. But instead, Arjun does go with the bishop. So, bishop c5, defending d4, and of course, knight takes d4 would lose a piece to simply bishop takes or rook takes. So that is not a possibility yet. Now, Magnus, in this position, how should he proceed? In the game, he goes knight 1 to d2, a solid square for the knight, but it's not the best. Instead, in the prior position, with the knight on f1, Magnus had the option of going g4 and then knight to g3. That would be the more aggressive option, intending perhaps g5, gaining space on the king side, maybe opening lines, maybe intending rook e to h1 in the future with the attack along the h-file. Now, instead, knight 1 d2 played in the game, and Arjun Erigaisi, he goes knight d7, again continuing the rerouting process of the knight. Now, here, rook e to a1 for Magnus, lining up all the pieces on these diagonals and files. Now look at this. All of the pieces are just barreling down on the a8 square. There's going to be some sort of tactic sooner or later coming up for Magnus. Now, bishop b6, Arjun trying to defend, but Magnus does go g4, opening up the second line of attack. Of course, he is attacking on the a file on the queen side, but now he has threats of g5, opening up yet more lines of attack. And again, after, say, h takes, Magnus could go rook a to h1 in the future, threatening ideas like queen to h7. That could be very dangerous. All right, Arjun Erigaisi, how is he going to defend? Well, he starts knight to c5, hitting the queen with tempo. The queen must move. Queen to f4 is the move. A very good square for the queen, and it perfectly sets up that g5 break next. Now Arjun, f6, trying to defend. He plays Ben Feingold's signature move, and it turns out to be quite a good move, despite Ben Feingold not being a fan of this move at all. Now, Magnus, knight to e4, centralizing the knight. Rook to f8 for Arjun, a very strong move. setting up threats of f takes e5, opening up the f file, and opening up the attack of the rook on the queen on f4. Now, Magnus, knight takes c5, trading the knights. Now bishop takes and rook to a6, flying in with the rook and threatening the pawn on e6. Excellent play by Magnus, especially for a blitz game. Now we have f takes e5, then queen takes e5, and the queens might come off the board, but Arjun Erigaisi says, no way, Jose, queen to b7. The queens are staying on, and now beyond that, queen takes f3 is the threat, and that knight on f3, beyond that, is pinned to the king on g2. Magnus Carlsen, what will he do about this threat? Well, he starts by ignoring it. Queen takes e6, winning the free pawn with check. Black must respect it. What's the move going to be here? Well, it turns out king to h7 is the strongest move, believe it or not. Yes, the king is vulnerable on this diagonal. For example, queen e4 or queen g6 would hit the king. However, that is the best move in this position. Instead of that, Arjun, he makes the first mistake in a while. Rook to f7. And this move here is the beginning of his problems in this game. And if you like puzzles, go and pause the video right now and try to find the beautiful tactical shot for Magnus Carlsen in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. Thank you so much for doing that. Here, Magnus Carlsen, of course, he plays the incredible move, queen takes c8, trading the queen for the rook temporarily. The point being, after queen takes, you go rook to a8, winning back the queen, and you're going to have an incredibly good endgame, being up a pawn. And of course, black's pawns on the queen side and the center are extremely weak and vulnerable. Now we have rook f8 defending, then rook takes, and then rook to a5, targeting that weak pawn on b5. Magnus Carlsen being the GOAT of endgames. He is in control here, but you can never count Arjun Erigaisi out. This guy is as resourceful and smart as it gets at the chessboard. Now, bishop e7, retreating the bishop. Now, rook takes b5, and of course, rook takes c2, flying in with the rook. And here, Arjun Erigaisi, he no longer has those double pawns on the queen side, and that means his endgame chances are a little bit better. Now, here, Magnus, knight takes d4, winning that free pawn on d4. He is temporarily up 2 pawns. Now, the rook is under attack. Rook c3 is the move, attacking both b3 and d3. Can Magnus hold on to those pawns? Let's find out. Knight f5 is the move, targeting that bishop on e7. The bishop must move. Bishop f8 is the response by Arjun, and now Magnus, he has to make a decision. Which pawns do you want to defend? There is simply no way to defend both pawns. For example, you can go knight d4. That defends b3, but it gives up d3 in the process. Now, knight d3 turns out to be the strongest move here, but instead of playing that, Magnus does go for the move d4, pushing that pass pawn down the board. And yes, pass pawns must be pushed, but it turns out that move is a little bit weaker, and Arjun Erigaisi is starting to crawl back in this game. All right, rook takes b3, winning the pawn, and now the pawn on b4, very importantly, is a pass pawn. That is going to be Arjun Erigaisi's main source of counterplay here in the endgame against Carlsen. All right, Carlsen, what should he do here? Turns out rook b6 is the strongest move, according to the engine, but instead g5, gaining more space on the king side. And the problem with this move is g6 turns out to be very strong for black. You go g6, driving back the knight, perhaps h5 next, and you are doing pretty well. Instead, h takes g5, played by Arjun. This is returning the favor. A mistake meets a mistake, and now h takes and g6. And it turns out Arjun would be better off with his h pawns on the board. Now here, knight h4, targets the weak pawn on g6, Arjun Erigaisi, bishop e7, he doesn't defend. Instead, he counterattacks on that pawn on g5. Now, knight takes g6, wins the pawn on g6, and Arjun finds a very strong move in this position. Bishop to d6. And the point being, the bishop on d6 absolutely dominates that knight on g6. For example, all of these squares are covered by the bishop. That is a very important detail. And now Arjun, he is ready for moves like rook e3, rook takes, b3, and so on. Now, Magnus, rook b6, pressuring the bishop. Bishop c7 retreats and hits the rook. Rook c6 is the move for Magnus. This turns out to be a weak move. Instead, rook b7 was necessary, getting to a light square, pressuring the bishop, and very importantly, staying behind the pass pawn where the rook belongs. Now here, Arjun, rook to c3, a very strong move, defending the bishop with the rook. And of course, if you go rook takes, then b takes c3 would win on the spot. The king is just too far away from the defense of the pawn. It would be outside the square of the pawn, and that means the king would not be in time to save the game. Now here, Magnus, rook to f6 is the move. Another slight inaccuracy. Instead, rook to a6 was preferable. Now Arjun Erigaisi, the key move is bishop d8, hitting the rook on f6 and putting pressure on that pawn on g5. Instead, b3 is the move, the right idea in principle, pushing that passed pawn down the board. But here, Magnus has the beautiful shot. Knight to e7, hitting the king. The king must move, king g7, and then knight to d5, hitting both the bishop on c7 and the rook on c3. Now, rook c1 gets out of the attack. Knight takes c7, wins the bishop. And here, Arjun Erigaisi, he does not go rook takes c7. That would be essentially a losing endgame after, say, rook to b6, and that pawn on b3 would not be heading down the board to promote. So instead, Arjun, b2 is the move, keeping the game alive. Now, Magnus, knight to e6, hits the king, king g8, rook f8, hits the king, king h7, rook b8, defending the b1 square. But here, Arjun, b1 comes anyway. And Magnus, he must give up the rook for the new queen. Rook takes b1, and then rook takes, and then king to f3. Here, Magnus marching his king down the board. The computer likes d5 a little better, but here Magnus still has decent winning chances. Now Arjun, king g6. It's going to be a close call here. King to f4, and now here Arjun, the key move is rook to f1, staying active with the rook, putting the rook behind the pawn, pressuring the pawn, and if white goes f3, again, the king will be tied to the defense of the pawn. That would be very good for Arjun. Instead, rook b5 is the move, cutting off the king on the 5th rank. And that is a very common idea in rook endgames, cutting off the king, preventing it from marching down the board. But it turns out, again, rook f1 was the right continuation. Now, here, Magnus, how should he continue? Well, the computer loves king g4, intending f4, then f5, marching your pawns down the board one way or another. Instead, the move is king to e4 for Magnus, and again, Arjun will have drawing chances here. Rook b1, finding the right idea. Again, the rook retreats, intending maybe rook e1 or f1 next. Now, Magnus d5, pushing his passed pawn down the board. Rook e1 hits the king, king f4, then rook to e2, pressuring the pawn on f1. Now, f3. Carlsen simply defending that pawn, but now rook to e1, retreating with the rook staying maximally active. Now, knight d4 for Magnus, rook d1, and then knight to c6, a very interesting move. And now, of course, that pawn on d5 is poisoned. If you go rook takes d5, then knight to d7 hits both the king on g6 and the rook. That would be game over on the spot, as white still has those two pawns to promote to queens. Now here, Arjun, king to f7 is the move, getting out of that potential fork. And now, of course, the pawn on d5 is being attacked. There would be no fork, and Magnus must defend. Now, here, the move in the game is king to e5, marching his king down the board. Instead, the computer likes knight to e5, but again, it's very, very complicated, especially for blitz. Instead, king to e5 played in the game. Now, rook e1 is the king, king to f5, and then rook d1 again targeting the pawn. Now, knight e5 check hits the king, king e7, g6, rook takes d5. It's going to be a close call. g7 pushing the pawn. Now here, Arjun Erigaisi, he must give up the rook for the knight. There's no other way. If you go, say, rook to d8, then again, there's going to be all kinds of ideas. Just king g6, intending king h7, and so on. And again, the king, the knight, and the pawn block off all these squares. There is nothing stopping king g6, then king h7, and then g8, promoting to a new queen. That would be game over on the spot. So here, Arjun, rook takes e5 is the move, giving up the rook for the knight, the rook / exchange sacrifice, whatever you want to call it. Now, king takes, then king to f7, g8 promotes to a queen, king takes, and here, Magnus, the final move of the game, king to f6, and after this, Arjun Erigaisi resigns on the spot to Magnus, and here's why. There is no stopping that pawn from promoting. All right, Arjun Erigaisi, if he wanted to play on, he would go, for example, king to f8, then Magnus could go f4, then king g8, f5, king f8, and then simply king to e6. Now king to e8 again is the best defense. Then white can go f6, king f8, then f7, king to g7 is forced, and then finally king to e7. And again, there is nothing stopping that pawn from promoting on f8. That would be game over on the spot, as Magnus is good enough to win with an extra queen. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video of Magnus versus Arjun Erigaisi from the 2023 World Chess Blitz Championships. If you did, go and smash that YouTube like button and leave a comment down below what you liked or didn't like. I'll do my best to respond to all comments. And while you're at it, check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen himself played a Ball Cloud style opening against Arjun Erigaisi. The audacity of Carlsen in that game was incredible. If you want to see some high-level Arjun versus Magnus chess, I highly recommend checking that game out. It is incredible. And I will see you in the next video.